I have a question for you. What was the very first horror story? Obviously, that's difficult to answer. Human beings have been trying to scare each other since the beginning of time, often with moral reasons attached, like, don't wander out alone at night, kids, or else the troll under the bridge will get ya.
What is your favorite color?
Blue.
Right, off you go.
Oh, thank you.
Or, we sure don't like anyone who's different from us. Let's label anyone who is a witch and then burn them. Or sometimes horror stories could simply be born out of superstition, like the Irish Banshee, known for wandering at night wailing to indicate that someone was about to die. But my point is, all of these stories were truly believed, at least by someone at some point, even if that person was just a child.
Lori, what's the boogeyman?
And all of these stories were folklore, passed by word of mouth primarily. When it came to traditional literature that was considered valuable enough to be recorded, that historically only came down to two genres, tragedy and romance. Romance at the time meaning more of an adventure or a quest. Love could be involved, but that wasn't a defining feature. And likewise, horror could be involved in any number of these stories, a good example of this being the witches in Macbeth or the ghosts in Hamlet. But we wouldn't really get a pure horror story recorded to paper until 1764, with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. If you've read the book, you might be wondering what about it is so historically significant. It's honestly a little dry, and if you've heard any horror story to this point, then you already know the plot. There's a virgin, a gross old dude who wants to defile her for some reason, a strapping young lad here to save the day, and there are ghosts involved. But in order to fully appreciate this book, and the way that it ignited the spark that would eventually become the entire horror genre, we're gonna have to get into a lot of context here. Strap in, boils and ghouls, I have a feeling that this is gonna be a long one. Part 1. Why Castle of Otranto? As mentioned before, The Castle of Otranto was written by Horace Walpole, the son of the first British Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. While Horace did follow his father into politics, he also expressed an interest in writing and history. Now you might be thinking that writing is the most important part of that description, but no, it was actually history that Horace Walpole loved more than anything, especially medieval history. Horace had a huge appreciation for the Gothic style of the medieval period. So much so that he actually had his home, known as the Strawberry Hill House, built in the likeness of this style. And for the record, goth at the time obviously didn't mean what it does today. If you're picturing architecture produced by the lovely nation-state of alternative fashion, then I wish you were right, but no. Goth is merely an old term for German. And the reason why the medieval Gothic style appealed so much to Horace was that to many at the time, it represented something that was contrary to the norm. Ever since Italian jack of all trades, Giorgio Vasari wrote that it was a barbarous style in his book, Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. Vasari credited the Goths for having destroyed the golden age of Rome.
The days of the Roman Empire are finally at an end. Now, the Goth tribes rule Rome.
And accused them of tearing down the beautiful Roman buildings only to replace them with ugly Gothic ones. To Horace and a growing population of people at the time, Gothic architecture represented everything contrary to what Rome represented at the time. If Rome was reason, order, and logic, then anything Gothic needed to be bold, emotional, and chaotic. And this idea proved attractive enough to Horace that he wanted to call upon it when he sat down to write his ghost story. The very first edition of the book was actually titled A Castle of Otranto, a Story, translated by William Marshall Gent, from the original Italian of Onofrio Muralato, canon at the Church of St. Nicholas at Otranto. Did you catch a couple of things odd about that title? Well, yes, one of them is that our friend, Horace Walpole, is not credited as the writer, but that can easily be explained away as William Marshall was his pseudonym. But dear Horace initially claimed to have merely translated a manuscript that may have even dated back as far as the 11th century, as 2 of the characters are described as fighting in the Crusades. The story itself is set in Italy, somewhere between the 11th and 13th century. This is interesting for a number of reasons, among them being that the first printing of the story led many to believe that this was a manuscript that Horace had merely stumbled upon and translated. And with this thought in mind, many people praised the book. Horace wasn't the only person obsessed with the Gothic style at the time, so a story that was set so firmly within that history was appealing to many. And critics noted that many of the supernatural elements called back heavily to William Shakespeare. But then something happened. Horace was like, hey guys, yeah, this is actually my book. I wrote it.
Give me credit.
His name was put on the 2nd edition of the novel, and he included an author's foreword that explained that the only reason why he was coming out now was that he felt he owed it to the fans of the novel. And I'm sure that it had nothing to do with the fame and glory that would have come with writing it.
Sure, Jan.
Is it just me, or does this whole thing have the same energy of horror movies claiming to be based off a true story nowadays?
What happened was true.
Anyway, perhaps because people felt cheated by Horace's big reveal, or perhaps because they were more willing to overlook the story's flaws back when they thought that it was an actual ancient relic. Either way, this reveal caused a big shift in the way that people would just generally always perceive horror.
Horror movies, mutilation, decapitation, torture. Does that sound entertaining?
All of a sudden, the Castle of Otranto was accused of being frivolous and immoral, based mostly on the fact that it didn't really have a message. It preyed more on emotion than logic. And not to mention, Manfred's attempts to constantly sleep with his daughter-in-law were perceived as just a little bit skeevy. But that isn't to say that that was everyone's opinion. The Castle of Otranto still had its following, and in fact, the political climate over the next few years would only encourage more writers to produce more Gothic stories. 1789, only 25 years after Horace Walpole released the very first Gothic novel. We got the French Revolution, which got a lot of people killed, but more importantly, it scared the bejeebers out of the British, who now not only faced more dangerous travel outside of their country, it made them more nervous at home, as they now had to fear the very real possibility that the British peasants might hear about what their French neighbors are doing and, follow suit. In 1794, 30 years after the Castle of Otranto, we got a pretty major response to the French Revolution in the form of Thomas Paine's The Age of Reasoning, being an investigation of true and fabulous theory. The Age of Reasoning was a pretty big deal because it basically made the argument that if the British wanted to avoid repeating the sins of the French, then they basically had to give themselves over completely to order and logic. One of the most shocking parts of this document to me is that Paine actually argued that people needed to give up religion. And as we all might have expected, telling people to give up their faith and basically live like Vulcans didn't really go over well. There were many who bought into it, sure, and those people weren't the ones reading Gothic novels, I can assure you of that. But for others, this escape into a world where logic just didn't have to exist, where you could just feel for a little while, whether that feeling be terror at the prospect of a monster or relief at the hero's success, seemed very appealing in a world that was moving farther and farther away from frivolity. This also contributes to the reason why ghosts and monsters feature so prominently in these stories. Yes, it is sort of drawn off of folklore, but more importantly, ghosts don't have to be logical. Someone who follows Paine's teachings might read a Gothic novel and just see silliness. Ghosts don't exist, that isn't possible.
The Luna ghost is in fact...
Old Man Smithers! The creepy janitor?
But to someone who is opposed to these teachings, these novels were a rebellion. Now I know that I've been talking about Gothic novels plural, but I've only really discussed one. Here are just a couple of highlights that very obviously followed in Horace's footsteps. In 1778, English author Clara Reeve released a preface to her novel The Old English Baron, which reads as follows. This story is the literary offspring of the Castle of Otranto, written upon the same plan, with a design to unite the most attractive and interesting circumstances of the ancient romance and modern novel. At the same time, it assumes a character and manner of its own that differs from both. It is distinguished by the appellation of a Gothic story, being a picture of Gothic times and manners. Anne Radcliffe became famous for writing stories that borrowed elements from the Castle of Otranto, to the point that she ended up earning the titles The Great Enchantress and Mother Radcliffe for the amount of influence that she had over the Gothic genre. She's also somewhat credited for creating a subgenre of Gothic called Female Gothic, which obviously deals with more feminine issues and has more women kicking butt, which is kind of awesome. Another book that it clearly inspired is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which is more of a parody of Gothic than anything, as it deals with a protagonist who clearly expects to find herself in a Gothic story and doesn't. And at this point, there might be one thing that you've noticed about the 3 authors that I've named. They're all women. Another reason why the time was right for the Gothic genre to pick up steam was because the 18th century actually saw the rise of something else very interesting: the novel. It's actually kind of impossible to say what the first English novel was. I'm focusing on English here exclusively because we're talking about an English writer, by the way. So I want to make sure that it's a work that Horace could realistically have been influenced by. I've heard some people credit Daniel Defoe's 1719 Robinson Crusoe as the first novel. Some people credit Jonathan Swift's 1726 Gulliver's Travels. It all depends on how you define a novel. But the point is, that was a style of writing that was gaining traction in the 18th century. Novels tended to be easier to write than poems or plays, as they generally required a little bit less education, and as such, 2 things happened. 1, we began to see a growing amount of women writers. Granted, most of these women were white and wealthy, and even so, they still had to publish under their husband's names or just leave their names off the cover altogether. But regardless, the Gothic genre is unique for having a decent amount of female representation. But perhaps because novels were easier to write, it was more difficult to get taken seriously if that was your medium of choice. There were exceptions at the time, of course, like Charles Dickens, but he didn't really get famous writing Gothic stories, a genre that was already considered sensational and frivolous, a reputation that suddenly having a high number of female writers didn't really help.
Excitable, emotional, prone to fantasy. Textbook case of female hysteria.
So if you haven't heard about Anne Radcliffe before today, I'm pretty sure you're not alone. A lot of these works did get lost to time, and the ones that we do have today were kept alive, thankfully, by Gothic cinema, which has managed to reboot these stories so many times that I'm pretty sure that we'll never entirely lose them. Anyway, let's backtrack a little bit here. We've been over a lot of history, and I can tell that you're all needing a snack. So here's a brief intermission before we move on to part 2. Ready? Okay, let's go. Part 2. What is Castle of Otranto? At this point, I've explained to you why the Castle of Otranto was released and why it drew an audience. But now I'm going to go more into depth about how it affected the horror genre. We see many elements in the Castle of Otranto that would later become staples in the horror genre. The setting is a huge example of this. Obviously, the story is tied heavily to that Gothic castle, a theme that we'd come to see in movies like House on Haunted Hill, Crimson Peak, and The Haunting.
Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone.
The story is set in Italy between the 11th and 13th century, and even this would become a staple in horror. Remember what I said about the French Revolution making travel more dangerous for the British? Well, as much as Horace set his story in Italy as an attempt to call upon that Gothic style, this idea of dangerous, far-off lands became more realistic when, you know, those peasants in France are chopping off people's heads like kindergarteners in a dandelion field.
Mama had a baby and her head popped off.
Also remember that this was just the beginning of horror and that it would take us a while to get to a Serbian film. The idea that your neighbor was doing something odd was intimidating. But the idea of it happening to, you know, someone else in a far-off land, that's fine. This would be challenged very quickly, of course. One of the major influences in this being the sensationalism around Jack the Ripper in 1888. And the discovery that he was probably a well-educated high society gentleman, providing further interest in stories like Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. But this idea of the terrifying foreigner is something that we see in horror movies to this day, in something like Hostel or Midsummer. It may also be worth taking note of the fact that Castle of Otranto takes place during the Crusades, as exploring the cruel side of religion would become a staple in the Gothic genre, such as in Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk. But it also appears in modern movies like The Lodge and Red State.
God doesn't love you. Less fear him.
Granted, when this was done in the past, it was done with what I believe to be slightly different intentions. The Monk is a perfect example of this, as it was written for a primarily Protestant audience, and the titular monk is Catholic, which is supposed to explain why he rapes his sister and murders his mom. Gothic literature came from a 0 to 100 real quick, you guys.
I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Although this does bring me to another theme that the Castle of Otranto introduced to the Gothic genre, and that is the use of incest, usually to imply that a character is bad or immoral.
You're not his sister.
I am.
Don't do it!
This theme still permeates the horror genre to this day, from something as normalized as Psycho to something as underground as a Serbian film. In the Castle of Otranto, this theme mostly enters in through the characters of Isabella and Manfred. The fact that she was once betrothed to Manfred's son makes her especially offended when he tries to rape her. At one point in the novel, Isabella even makes the following comment: "I was contracted to the son. Can I wed the father? No, madam, no. Force should not drag me to Manfred's hated bed. I loathe him. I abhor him. Divine and human laws forbid." While it may not be incest by blood, it is very clear through the way that the text treats the relationship that it might as well be incest. It may also be argued that the Castle of Otranto gave us the prototype of what would become our standard horror characters. Manfred is our villain, beginning a trend of villains who are far too sexual towards their female counterparts, who are often younger, prettier, and at least implied to be virginal.
Guys think I'm too smart.
Of course, the idea of the persecuted virgin and the sexual predator is a tale as old as time, as is the strapping hero that comes in to save the day. But a little bit more particular to the horror genre would be the characters of Matilda and Hippolyta, both of whom are easily the most interesting characters in the book, but that isn't saying much. Hippolyta is Manfred's wife, who goes insane when she finds out about his plans to divorce her and marry their once future daughter-in-law. This began the trope known as the Mad Woman in the Attic, popularized by feminist literary critics Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar in 1979. Gilbert and Gubar argued that there were only two ways that women were represented in Victorian Gothic. They could be virgins or they could be mad women. Well, they claimed that the mad woman was more blatantly damaging to women, because feminist and marginalized women tend to be depicted as mad women more than they are virgins. It was important for both tropes to stop being used, because they were both equally harmful. If any of this sounds of interest to you, then I would definitely recommend checking out their book. The Madwoman in the Attic, the woman writer, and the 19th century literary imagination. The most famous example of the Madwoman in the Attic in literature would probably have to be Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, who goes insane when her husband locks her in the attic. And is this trope still around today? Look, you guys, the horror genre really doesn't change all that much. But that being said, I do feel that the treatment of the Madwoman in the Attic is very, very different nowadays. For example, we have Eleanor in The Haunted, Annie in Hereditary, and Dani from Midsummer. All of these are examples of madwomen whose descent from grace is more or less treated as a tragedy. And more than that, it's used to explore themes of abuse, loss, or mental illness. But that being said, we do still get the less than favorable examples of the madwoman, like Valerie in Slumber Party Massacre 2, where her madness is used more of an excuse to just remove her from the plot and not as a means to explore actual mental illness. And lastly, let's take a look at Matilda. Matilda is daughter to Manfred and Hippolyta, and she's described as being pretty and virginal because, as Gilbert and Gubar pointed out, that was pretty much the only option for female characters who still had their marbles. She's in love with our handsome hero Theodore, and although he loves her too, they're forced to remain apart by their parents. But after Theodore rescues Isabella, my regular understanding of horror just starts to falter, because all of a sudden, Theodore has 2 virgins to choose between. That just doesn't happen. Usually, one's a whore. But what I should have paid closer attention to was the fact that Matilda's daddy said no. That makes her forbidden. As much as Matilda is characterized as a virgin, she's still the more dangerous choice for Theodore. So when you see this dichotomy between Matilda, the tragic and forbidden beauty, set against Isabella, is it any wonder that the former eventually got turned into the whole horror trope? I mean, it's just easy shorthand to communicate that she's pretty if you can see her boobs. You do feel a little bit sorry for her if she dies. But the reason why you can't be with her is because, well, you know, we saw her boobs. This type of character was especially popular in the slasher genre, with prominent examples being Linda from Halloween, Tina from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Tatum from Scream.
You want to play psycho killer? Can I be the helpless victim?
As dumb as all this is, I can't help but respect it just a little bit. Horace Walpole, thank you for bringing us the very first Gothic novel. Thank you so much for joining me here today, my pets, and I will see you next time. Love you.
Scoob and me don't do castles.
Why not?
Because castles have paintings with eyes that watch you and suits armor you think's a statue, but there's a guy inside who follows you every time you turn around.
How many times has that actually happened?
Although donating to my Patreon is unnecessary, it is hugely appreciated. As little as $3 a month could help me put out many more videos. In that note, I would like to thank Wilson L. Ricks III, Scott Falks, and Andre K. Thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me. I can't wait to see you all next time.